You walk into a canyon. The walls rise up on either side of you, hundreds of feet of red rock. So close in places you could almost touch both sides at once. The path twists and turns. There is no sign of a city. There is no sign of anyone, just stone and shadow and the narrow strip of sky far above your head. And then the canyon opens, and carved directly into the cliff in front of you, 16 stories tall, its columns and crown cut straight out of the living rock, is one of the most breathtaking things human beings have ever made. This is Petra. A city hidden inside the mountains of southern Jordan that was carved, not built, out of solid desert stone more than 2,000 years ago. A place so remote and so well concealed that for centuries the outside world forgot it existed at all. But here is the real question, the one that has haunted every traveler who has ever stood in that canyon and looked up. Not just, how did they make this? But who were they? How did a people build a metropolis of stone in one of the driest, most hostile deserts on Earth, grow rich enough to rival empires, and then vanish so completely that we almost lost them forever? This is the story of the people of Petra, how they lived, how they did the impossible, and how they disappeared. First, you have to understand where you are and why nothing about this place should be possible. Petra sits in a rugged desert valley in what is now southern Jordan, in a region of jagged sandstone mountains, sun-blasted rock, and almost no water. This is not a green and gentle land. Summers are brutally hot. Rain, when it comes rarely and violently, in sudden flash floods that tear through the canyons. It is the kind of place where you would expect to find nothing but scorpions and silence. And the way in is the strangest part. The main entrance to Petra is a natural crack in the mountains called the Seek, a canyon over 1 kilometer long and in places only a few meters wide, with walls towering more than 100 meters overhead. To enter the city, you have to walk single file down this winding stone corridor, with no idea what waits at the end. It is dark, cool, and completely enclosed, and it made Petra almost impossible to attack. An enemy army couldn't march in. They could only trickle in, one at a time, into the waiting city beyond. The people who chose this spot didn't stumble into it. They chose it precisely because it was hidden, defensible, and sat at a crossroads no one else could control. So who were they? They were called the Nabateans, and they started out as something that makes what they built even more astonishing: nomads. The Nabateans began as a wandering desert people, roaming the Arabian sands with their herds, living in tents, moving with the seasons. They had no cities, no monuments, no fixed home. By every expectation, they should have stayed that way, a footnote in the history of the desert. But the Nabateans had one enormous advantage. They understood the desert better than anyone alive. They knew its hidden water sources, its secret roots, its rhythms. And they realized that their harsh, empty homeland sat directly across the path of something the entire ancient world desperately wanted: trade. 2,000 years ago, some of the most valuable substances on Earth were not gold or jewels. They were scents. Frankincense and myrrh, the fragrant resins burned in temples and used in medicine and burial across the ancient world, were worth staggering sums. They came from southern Arabia, and to reach the wealthy markets of the Mediterranean, They had to be carried thousands of miles across brutal desert. And the safest way across that desert ran straight through Nabatean territory. The Nabateans became the masters of that trade. Their caravans of camels hauled incense, spices, silk, and precious goods across the sands. They knew where the water was, and their rivals didn't. They could guide a caravan safely through a wasteland that would kill outsiders. They charged for protection, for guidance, for passage, and slowly, this nation of former nomads grew astonishingly, almost unbelievably rich. And they poured that wealth into one place, a hidden valley guarded by a secret canyon, Petra, their capital and their masterpiece. Now here's the part that turns Petra from an impressive city into a genuine miracle. Because to build a great city, you need one thing above all else: water. And Petra sits in a desert that barely has any. The people who lived here should have died of thirst. Instead, the Nabateans became some of the most brilliant water engineers of the ancient world. They studied their harsh land and they bent it to their will. They carved channels into the rock to catch every drop of the rare rainfall and guide it where they wanted it. They cut hundreds of cisterns and reservoirs into the stone to store water through the long, dry months. They built dams to control the deadly flash floods and even diverted those floods away from the Seek so the city wouldn't drown. They built ceramic pipe systems that carried fresh water across the city with carefully controlled flow. They took a place with almost no water and engineered it so well that Petra could support a population of perhaps 20 to 30,000 people, with gardens, fountains, and pools in the middle of the desert. Visitors from greener lands were stunned. The Nabateans had made water flow in a place that should have been barren. That, more than any monument, is the true genius of Petra. And then, of course, there is the stone. The Nabateans didn't build most of Petra the way other cities were built, brick on brick, block on block. They carved it. They took the towering cliffs of soft red sandstone and cut their buildings directly into the rock face, from the top down, sculpting facades, doorways, columns, and chambers straight out of the mountain itself. The most famous is the building that greets you at the end of the Seek, known today as the Treasury, or Al-Khazneh. 40 meters tall, its intricate columns and carvings cut flawlessly into the cliff. It was almost certainly a grand tomb, a monument to a Nabatean king. And its name, the Treasury, comes from a much later legend that a pharaoh had hidden gold in the stone urn carved at its very top. A legend so persistent that the urn is still scarred with old bullet holes from people who tried to shoot it open. But here's what most people don't realize. The treasury is just the doorway. Beyond it lies an entire city. Hundreds and hundreds of carved structures spread across a vast valley. A giant monument called the monastery, even bigger than the treasury, reached by climbing 800 steps into the mountains. A Roman-style theater carved into the rock that could seat thousands. Tombs, temples, staircases, altars, homes, an entire civilization's capital, sculpted out of the cliffs. To walk through Petra is to walk through a city that its people didn't so much construct as release from the stone. So they had wealth, water, and a fortress city that dazzled the ancient world. Which brings us to the great mystery. What happened to them? How does a people this powerful, this ingenious, simply disappear? The answer is a slow unraveling from several directions at once. The first blow was Rome. As the Roman Empire expanded, it eventually absorbed the Nabatean kingdom, annexing it in the early 2nd century. Petra didn't fall in fire and slaughter, it was quietly swallowed. And under Roman control, the thing that had made the Nabateans rich began to slip away. Because the second blow was the trade itself. Over time, the great overland incense routes that Petra had controlled lost their importance. Sea trade grew, and merchants began moving goods by ship instead of by camel across the desert. The caravans that were Petra's lifeblood dwindled. The crossroads the city had been built to command slowly stopped mattering. And then came the earth itself. Petra sits in a region prone to earthquakes, and a series of powerful quakes over the following centuries damaged the city again and again, wrecking buildings and, critically, shattering the very water systems the Nabateans had so brilliantly engineered. In a desert, a broken water system is a death sentence. Wealth gone, trade gone, water systems in ruins. One by one, the reasons to live in Petra vanished. And so, gradually, over generations, the people left. The great carved city was slowly abandoned, and the desert began to reclaim it. And here is the strangest chapter of all. Petra didn't just decline, it was forgotten. For centuries, the wider Western world lost track of Petra almost entirely. The magnificent carved city sat empty in its hidden valley, known only to the local Bedouin tribes who lived among its ruins and, understandably, kept the location of their home to themselves. To the great cities of Europe, Petra became little more than a rumor, a half-remembered legend of a rose-red city lost somewhere in the desert. It stayed that way until 1812, when a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, traveling in disguise and speaking Arabic, convinced a local guide to lead him through the Sikh, under the pretext of making a sacrifice at a nearby tomb. He stepped out of that canyon, saw the treasury glowing in the rock, and quietly realized he had rediscovered one of the lost wonders of the ancient world. Word spread, and Petra, hidden for so long, became one of the most famous places on Earth. But it was never truly empty. Because through all those centuries of so-called abandonment, people did live in Petra. They lived inside it. The Bedouin of the region, in particular, a tribe known as the Bedouin, made their homes among the ruins for generations, sheltering in the very tombs and caves the Nabateans had carved, herding goats through the ancient streets, raising their families in the shadow of the treasury. To the outside world, Petra was a lost ruin. To them, it was simply home, the same red rock sheltering people as it had for thousands of years. It was only in the 20th century, as Petra became a world-famous site and eventually a protected wonder, that the Bedouin were resettled into a village nearby, in the 1980s, to preserve the ancient city. But many of them still spend their days in Petra, guiding visitors, selling tea and trinkets, running camels and donkeys along the ancient paths, still deeply connected to the stones their ancestors sheltered in. The people of Petra never fully left, they just changed. So think about what Petra really is. It's a city carved into a cliff by a people who began as nomads with nothing but their knowledge of the desert. A civilization that grew rich by mastering trade routes no one else could cross, and then took that wealth and turned solid rock into palaces, temples, and tombs. A place where engineers made water flow through a wasteland, and sculptors released an entire capital from the mountains. And then it's a mystery and a lesson, because for all their genius, the Nabateans could not carve their way out of history. When the trade dried up and the earth shook and the empires shifted, even the most ingenious people in the desert could not hold their impossible city. They faded and were nearly forgotten, and their masterpiece sat silent in the sand for 1,000 years. We tend to think of the great edges of the world, the impossible places, as harsh and empty. But Petra tells a different version of the story. Sometimes the impossible place isn't the one where people are barely hanging on. Sometimes it's the one where they built something so magnificent that it outlived them entirely and waited patiently in the rock for the world to find it again. There are more of these places than you'd think. Cities and settlements at the far edges of what should be possible. Still standing, still hiding, still waiting. If you want to keep finding them, subscribe. There are a lot more edges of the map left to reach.